Hello, my name is Gianluca Parolin. I'm the faculty lead on the governance program here at ISMC, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to this dialogue series event on governance and public policy in early 19th century and 20th century Egypt. And it's also my distinct pleasure to welcome two wonderful speakers, which will illuminate us on a very topical border of governance and how that border shifted especially through the translation movement in early 19th century Egypt. So I'll switch directly to Junaid Quadri from the University of Illinois at Chicago.
Thanks, Gianluca, for your introduction and also for helping organize my coming here, and also Dr. Charlotte Whiting for helping with all the logistics and getting me here. So what I wanted to do a little bit is, because this is organized under the rubric of governance, to think about governance, the way my work sort of fits into this rubric is to think about governance in terms of authority, and especially how the locus of or source of that authority is understood. And I'm focusing here very much on not the 19th but the 20th century, but same place in Egypt. So in April of 1925, the Egyptian Muslim scholar and judge Ali Abdul Razik published a book that turned out to be something of a bombshell. Titled Islam and the Foundations of Political Power, Abdul Razik's book advanced a forthright argument for the separation between religion and state in Islam. The contemporary Egyptian writer Muhammad Imara has characterized it as the first attempt to Islamicize secularism, to claim that Islam is secular. For the views he expressed in this work, Abdul Razik met with strong opposition from his colleagues at the famed Azhar University, and in a matter of months he had been expelled from the community of ulama by the Council of Senior Scholars. Writing some 35 years later, the academic Nadav Safran commented in his study of liberal nationalist thinkers that the timing of Abdul Razik's publication, coming as it did in the wake of the abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate, served to focus attention on the relevance of the institution of the Caliphate. But, Safran suggested, Abdul Razik was advancing, in fact, a more fundamental thesis. Quote, that Islam is, on the one hand, an exclusively spiritual community, and on the other, a code of disciplinary and religious precepts binding upon the individual conscience without any relation to power and politics, unquote. It is on the second of these understandings of secularism that I wish to focus my comments tonight. In particular, I want to probe the notions of individual conscience and religion and the distance from power and politics that they are thought to imply. To do so, I want to look at two very different figures in the early 20th century to think through, in a rather preliminary sort of way, the kinds of questions that were occupying Muslim Egyptian thinkers of this period, focusing specifically on an increasing emphasis on a notion of the human person as a self-governing individual capable of independent ethical evaluation. So I want to point out that both of the texts I focus on here, or that I will focus on today, were written before this 1925 watershed moment, or supposed watershed moment, right? Suggesting that the kinds of questions that came to a rather controversial head with the Abdul Razik affair were areas of concern well before he published his book. Some 4 or 5 years earlier, the important writer Ahmed Amin published the Kitab al-Akhlaq, a book on ethics, that was incorporated into the curriculum of secondary schools and was also taught to teachers of primary schools. This was part of a flowering interest in ethics in Egypt that started at least at about the turn of the century, and included publishing old Islamic classics, translations of contemporary European writers, and a retranslation of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics by Ahmed Lutfi as-Sayyid. Amin had been educated at the Azhar and the College for Sharia Judges, and taught at both the college and the Egyptian University. He is identified most strongly, though, with his affinity with liberal circles, best known for a work examining the history of Islam, which stressed its rationalist side. In the Kitab al-Akhlaq, too, Amin's liberal side is on rather clear display. So the book is centered, as one might expect of a book of ethics, on the twin concepts of good and evil, But, says Amin, determining what is good and what is evil requires a standard by which we make these judgments. Just as when we say something is tall or short, we use the unit of the meter as a yardstick, or when we say something is heavy or light, we use, or at least the Egyptians did, the unit of the uqqa or the ratl. These are all kind of weights. So must we have some sort of measure against which the valuations that truthfulness is good or lying is evil can make any sense. Amin lays out three rather general schools, what he calls madhahib, that give different answers to this question. So the first answer is personal happiness. This is the egoism, or what he calls the egoistic hedonism, in which he pulls together Epicurus from the ancients and Hobbes from the moderns. The second is general happiness, by which he means the utilitarianism of Bentham and Mill. And the last is what he calls intuition, in which things are good or evil for intrinsic reasons or for attaining virtue. Here he has in mind the Stoics among the ancients and Kant from among the moderns. So this is, as you can tell, a kind of general survey, perhaps an imprecise survey. After providing an overview of each, Amin sides with the version of the last school, what he calls intuition. He cannot accept the notion that ethics can be reduced to pleasure and pain, or a ledger that balances positive and negative consequences, deeming this the behavior of merchants. Rather, he says, it is the case that, quote, man was born such that contained in his depths is a faculty that shows him that some actions are good and others are bad, not by virtue of their effects in producing pleasure or pain, but rather in and of themselves. This is the conscience. And Amin devotes a standalone chapter to explaining to his young Egyptian audience what this conscience is. Rather than provide a detailed account of this chapter, I want to instead bring your attention to a few salient themes that I hope will help us understand his project better. The first is his discussions relative autonomy from religion and tradition. Islam and Christianity enter into the picture as part of Amin's justification for why he cannot accept consequentialist accounts of ethics, because the charity, ihsan, altruism, ithar, and sacrifice spoken about plainly by the two religions cannot be properly understood as virtues in consequentialist readings. But for a thinker who was preoccupied throughout much of his life with providing a rereading of early Islamic history, and especially in a work that is meant to educate young students, it is remarkable that otherwise references to religious traditions are vanishingly few. Amin's progressivism, in the form of a suspicion of tradition and custom as ethical guides, is on full display. Interestingly, he uses for tradition or for custom the word urf here, which has been, which is interesting because it's been mobilized today to afford some ethical distance from the textuality of scripture. Whereas here he's kind of assimilating it to scripture and religion and tradition. Oddbjorn Leirvik from the University of Oslo has commented on how the notion of a supreme ideal, al-mathal al-a'la, used by later writers to insert what he calls Quranic God talk into the equation, is not used for that purpose by Amin, who instead, quote, rather speaks empirically of the different supreme ideals that guide the peoples of the earth. As Safran has also mentioned, Amin is one of a group of progressivist scholars who, quote, rejected any notion of ethics as founded on positive divine revelation and any idea of superhuman or otherworldly sanction, and relied rather on the individual conscience, social responsibility, or the sanction of society to provide the necessary support for ethical norms. There's also Amin's choice, sort of under this heading of religion and tradition, also his choice of reference and terms. So whereas it would be quite possible to think about ethics by turning to classical Islamic schools of theology, these seem to make no appearance in Amin's work. Rather than husn and qubh, right, Arabic terms for good and evil, that would have been an obvious point of reference, given that they dominated the extensive and detailed jurisprudential discussions of moral philosophy for centuries, Amin uses the alternative Arabic terms khair and shar, which also translate to good and evil. Even more remarkably, though, the loaded terms ta'a and isyan, disobedience and obedience, which are used throughout the Quran to talk about one's relationship to God. So, for example, when Satan disobeys God, he performs isyan, he does isyan. These are reserved for talking about the moral agent's relationship not to God, but to his conscience, and to the laws also of civilized society. The second theme that I'd like to address is Amin's sources for thinking about conscience. This is not to belabor his debt to European thinkers, but rather to understand better his rather eclectic understanding of conscience when viewed from the perspective of Europe. Lerovic has commented on Egyptian writers' extensive engagement with Rousseau, going back as far as Rifat al-Hatawi in the first half of the 19th century. And indeed, in Amin's understanding of conscience, there are echoes of Rousseau, who thought of conscience as a moral guide and restraint. Amin explains how a conscience functions temporally, before a moral act, during it, and after it. In the before phase, he uses the words hadi and murshid, so guides, explicitly, to refer to the element of a conscience that warns the moral agent from doing evil and tries to restrain him, or commands the performance of obligations and encourages him to continue that performance. But conscience is also a judge, uses the word qadi, and an enforcer of the judgment, a formulation that might fit better with Kant's understanding of conscience as an inner court present within humans. This takes us away from Rousseau's focus on sentiment and feeling and towards a Kantian focus on judgment. Amin uses the Arabic for judgment, hukum, that is applied also to court rulings. Finally, though Amin thinks of conscience as a natural faculty that exists in young children and even in animals, it is not an innate source of goodness imperiled by the danger of a corrupt society that will obscure it, as suggested by Rousseau. Though Amin shares Rousseau's interest in moral education, he does not share the French philosopher's suspicion of society. For him, a good conscience is not one that uncovers that original pristine state despite societal influences, but neither is it merely a reflection of society's prejudices as maintained by, for example, Montaigne and Hobbes. Rather, conscience for Amin is a natural faculty that grows and becomes more refined when proper attention is paid to it. It is in need of education or moral development. It can err, especially when it is immature, and it can become weak or sick or even die. But when it is properly developed through repeatedly following its imperatives, keeping the company of good people, and reading books that enjoin virtue, it can also be strengthened. Along with education and a strong will, then, societal experience is an essential element of a healthy conscience. To think in terms of sources, then, this is reminiscent more of the virtue ethics that was an integral part of Islamic ethical thought, which stresses repetition and habituating oneself towards the demands of virtue, rather than, as Amin says, quote, accustoming oneself to evil by repeatedly placing evil before the soul. The third theme I want to point out very quickly is the important link between conscience and nation building, especially as it applies to what we may call civilization talk. Just as the conscience varies within the life of an individual, it can vary by time and place. There is a hint of Amin's progressivism on display when he suggests that one of the accomplishments of the modern period has been to minimize interreligious disputes between Muslims and Christians in Egypt, thanks to a new, more correct understanding of what conscience demands. More obvious, however, is his claim that the imperatives of conscience are rather simple in primitive states, or you might understand this as a state of nature, but in civilized states, in which people follow laws of society that in turn help him live a life of conscience and increase its authority, the conscience may be refined to a point such that individuals give entirely of themselves in defense of their opinions and in the path of the reform of their nation. The final point I want to bring your attention to is Amin's very strong defense of freedom of conscience. Even though conscience differs from place to place and time to time, and even though conscience is not infallible, every person is nonetheless bound to obey his or her conscience. He is bound to obey what he believes to be right, not what is correct in reality. If he is proven to be wrong, he bears no ethical responsibility, because his obligation is to follow his conscience. This, needless to say, is a remarkably individualist notion of the human person. I turn now to my second figure and his understanding of the term religion. This is someone who's not quite as well known, but it's someone who I've worked on for some time. Muhammad Bakhit al-Muti'i was the Mufti of Egypt for a spell in the 19-teens, and a senior religious scholar at the Azhar, a rather prominent religious scholar at the Azhar. When Abdul Razik, who we met at the beginning of my talk, published his controversial work, one of his most vocal critics was Bakhit himself, who not only served on the council that revoked the former's credentials, identifying him as a member of scholarly officialdom, but also Bakhit wrote a lengthy rejoinder to the arguments advanced in his book. It is evident from that response that in the immediate aftermath of the abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate, Bakhit, like his colleagues, was severely opposed to the hard political secularism that denied a role for Islamic normativity in affairs of state. Despite this, however, I hope to show that Bakhit was not untouched by the intellectual currents of the period, including a certain type of Muslim secularity. So scholars of secularism have in recent years opened up important new avenues for allowing us to think in deeper and more expansive ways about the secular that go far beyond the formulaic separation of religion and state. Among the most important of these has been the insistence of the anthropologist Talal Asad that the secular emerged together alongside a certain conception of religion as Siamese twins, mutually constitutive elements reflecting a modern reconfiguration of power. For Asad, the powers of the secular function to create a new understanding of religion as an abstract form or essence, which transcended more particular forms of life. A similar argument is sketched out by Charles Taylor in his monumental A Secular Age. Following up these contributions with an eye to the global, Jose Casanova has observed that one of the most important political trends has been, quote, the globalization of the category of religion itself, and of the binary classification of reality, religious, secular, that it entails. Looking to Bakhit allows us to better understand these developments as they unfolded in the context of Egyptian society. In the fall of 1910, the Khedive of Egypt, Abbas Hilmi II, received a telegram from Aswan in Upper Egypt, informing him that a local judge had authenticated a testimony claiming that the crescent had been sighted, signaling the end of the fasting month of Ramadan. The Khedive in turn sent word to Bakhit, then head of the Sharia court in Alexandria, asking him for his learned opinion on the appropriateness of acting upon a religious report that was transmitted by the telegraph. Bakhit responded that it should indeed be acted upon across Egypt, and subsequently wrote a treatise justifying his position. As we will see, his argumentation in this work permits us a window through which to better understand the changing connotations of the term deen, which is usually translated as religion. In particular, placing Bakhit's text within the context of the preceding Hanafi legal school to which he belonged reveals a remarkable shift from a complex notion of deen in the pre-modern period, as understood in terms of both transcendent and immanent concerns, so both of them, to one which Bakhit understands exclusively in terms of transcendence. But in order to understand how this shift occurs in the thought world of Islamic law, it is important to take a step back and think about an intriguing distinction made by some pre-modern Muslim jurists, in particular those who were associated with this Hanafi legal school. Virtually any conveying of a message is classified in fiqh works or in Islamic law works as a report, a khabar. The two major subdivisions subsumed by this category are, on the one hand, narrations, the preeminent exemplars of which are the prophetic traditions, famously known as hadith, and, on the other hand, in-court testimonies, shahadat, which in a legal system that was, at least in theory, suspicious of written documentation, encompass much of the proceedings of a court, statements by witnesses, but also confessions, claims, advisory opinions known as fatwas, and even legal verdicts themselves. These two subtypes were mutually exclusive and were often set off against one another as opposites. In the Hanafi school, however, these two types did not exhaust the set of khabars, reports. There existed also a little used hybrid category, which was thought not to be adequately captured by either of the first two, though it resembled, this is the word that gets used, resembled both of them in certain aspects. This is the category in which we find the umur diniya, the religious matters, which I want to focus on to think about religion. The most prominent example of which was a claim by an individual that he or she had cited the new moons as signaled the onset of the month of Ramadan. Pre-modern Hanafi jurists envisioned the Ramadan case as being a religious matter, which participated in each of the two main subcategories discussed above, so because it was a hybrid. It was a narration in that it demanded a certain moral probity of the narrators involved, and it was a testimony insofar as the entire process was regulated through the legal authority of courts. The claim was to be presented before a judge, who was authorized to assess and pronounce on its validity. So, at least in the Hanafi school, the role of the judge was central and could only be sidestepped in exceptional cases. Deeming the sighting of the Ramadan moon a religious matter incorporates two important semantic ranges of the term deen. On the one hand, pre-modern dictionaries prominently included words for a legal judgment, ruling, or sentence, al-qada, al-hukm, under deen. This, as Wilfred Cantwell Smith has pointed out, is an ancient Semitic root with a long history in the Middle East. But at the same time, deen is also connected to the notion of proper conduct, obedience, or ritual worship, ibadah. Thus, the connection between the sighting of the new moon and the initiation of the ritual act of fasting means that the former, the sighting of the new moon, can easily be subsumed under the meaning of deen as pertaining to ritual worship. On this reading, the umur diniya, the religious matters, could be understood as being oriented towards God and the afterlife. The technical term diyana, derived from the same root as deen, was often explained by the phrase that which is between man and God. But deen, on this formulation, the religious matters, was not quite conceptualized in terms of the religion-secular dichotomy with which we are familiar. Even as it was oriented or directed towards the other world, it did not exclude involvement with this world. This explains why, importantly, the characterization of the Ramadan moon sighting as one of the umur diniya was not understood by Hanafis as a reason to exclude it from the mundane regulation of the courts. So, for example, long before the telegraph, reports of sightings that traveled from one jurisdiction to another were overseen by the regulating authority of the courts and structured around in-court testimonies. Indeed, for Hanafis, the meanings for deen that signified legal process and judgment, al-qada, seemed to be no less a constituent element of what was nonetheless considered a religious matter. Because of their hybrid resemblance to both narrations and testimonies, the umur dini on this older formulation were no less concerned with the materiality of human life as they were with the other world. But by the time Bakhit revisited this question in 1910, however, circumstances had changed considerably. In addition to political changes and reconfigurations of the court system that separated the jurisdiction of the Sharia concerns from other civil, criminal, and commercial cases, there was also a new way of thinking about what religion was. As Abdul Qadir Tayyab has argued, for Egyptian modernists like Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, who were engaged in refuting materialism, religion came to be understood as the antithesis of naturalism. Its essence lay in the existence of a higher reality. Charles Taylor has commented that the obviousness of the distinction between the natural and supernatural, or immanent and transcendent, is a peculiar feature of modern life, what he calls a constitutive dimension of modern experience. For figures like Afghani, religion was coming to be understood increasingly as that which pertains to a transcendent realm, conceptually distinct from nature. But it was not just modernists like Afghani who understood religion in this way. Bakhit did too, as his text reveals. When it comes to his intervention in the case of the moon sighting controversy, Bakhit's contribution is to eliminate altogether the insistent Hanafi concern with court procedure. Importantly, this shift is made necessary and not just possible because of the underlying transformation in the very conception of deen itself. Bakhit is himself rather clear on this point. New moon sightings are religious reports. Thus they resemble the narration, riwaya, and so it is impossible that any of them are subject to the Qadi's judgment. Notably, it is precisely the description of the reports as being religious that now disqualifies them from the Qadi's regulatory control, a sharp departure from the prevailing Hanafi tradition. Whereas his predecessors thought religious matters resembled both the narration and the testimony, and had a difficult time imagining that such reports could have any standing independent of the validating authority of the Qadis, Bakhit finds this a nonsensical proposition. For him, the central criteria to be considered is not the integrity of the procedural mechanisms which had defined Hanafi thinking on the issue for so long, but rather the truth content of the report itself. This significantly is a secularizing move that removes us from a primary occupation with the mediation of the courts and the materiality and authority of the bodies that inhabit them towards the abstract realm of individual minds. Thanks. I didn't know when to do it, but importantly, this cognitive turn is thought to be justified and indeed commonsensical, simply because the reports in question have traditionally been labeled diniya, a descriptor which has come to have a new meaning in a new age. In effect, the previously distinct category of the umur diniya has been assimilated entirely, has been assimilated entirely to the category of narrations precisely because the former are religious matters, and so opposed in this binary scheme to the worldly concerns of testimonies. To be religious is not now only to be ritualistically oriented towards the transcendent, but also to be separate from the world, and so governed by a logic that properly belongs to the realm of the transcendent. It is telling that this argument proceeds in the context of a discussion about how to handle the telegraph. Bakhit's response to the question that motivated his book is to imagine the telegraph as an inner medium which does not impinge on the truth value of the report. In terms of validity, telegraph reports are for him identical with in-person spoken communication, the medium for long exclusively favored by Islamic law. Timothy Mitchell has commented that in the 19th century, the telegraph came to be the paradigmatic symbol of a new ontology, the one we encountered earlier, which distinguished not only between body and mind, but also introduced a third layer, a metaphysical realm of meaning having an ideal existence to which symbols in the mind pointed or referred, or more properly, which it represented. Mitchell references the philologist Michel Breuil of the Collège de France, who notes approvingly that, quote, words are signs. They have no other existence than the signals of the wireless telegraph. It is noteworthy that Bakhit should think religious reports, by virtue of their being religious, belong properly to this model. The idea of an ideal realm, an abstract essence outside of the world, fits well with the conception of religion I have been discussing above. Religious matters then came to represent for Bakhit precisely those issues that, like telegraph reports, transcended materiality. They were ineligible for adjudication and regulation by courts and unperturbed by their relationship to the world. They came to be conceived by their very nature as abstractions, whose locus was the minds of private individuals, and so the private religious sphere of society in general. They are no longer concerned with law, but rather ethics, which, Asad has pointed out, are, quote, a matter of following one's conscience, not of obeying externally given commands. The individual, private character of ethical decisions must, Asad goes on, stand free equally of the power of the state and the demands of one's community. So very briefly, by way of conclusion, let me draw your attention once more to the two very different figures that I've gathered together in this paper. Despite the divergence in their intellectual training, genre of writing, and scholarly agendas, I've tried to argue here they were confronting an intellectual and political context which brought to the fore shared concerns. Turning our attention away from the famous controversies such as the acceptance of Abdul-Razak's bombshell work, and towards these intellectual developments instead helps us better understand the deep societal significance of these questions in a changing world. By juxtaposing these two very different figures, I've tried to outline in a rather preliminary way a noticeable shift in Egyptian Muslim thinking towards a more thoroughgoing notion of the human as an individual, capable of independent ethical evaluation, and with more tenuous relations to external powers. Thank you.
Thank you both for asking for other questions. I was wondering if, when you look at conscience, right, that is so central in the articulation of your paper, if you feel any connection to the kind of work that has been done on not just medical textbooks, but the translation of other hard sciences in the previous century. Because somehow the Ahmed Amin was brought up in the new establishment for the training of Shari judges, actually showing that judges no longer were Shari. You had to say that they were Shari to identify them as Shari. But so sort of like a mixed form of education for them. So do you think so how do you see the relation between the scholars that you looked at and the trickling in of those texts into the general curriculum, both in the religious sciences and outside of it?
So that's a good question. I mean, I don't see. I've not looked at all of these texts, right? In fact, the conscience element of the paper, the conscience half of the paper, is something that's rather new. But to the extent that I've looked at these texts, I don't see evidence of that sort of, but of course, as you sort of pointed out, there's lots of indications of some. I mean, as one of the other things that I think that we have in common here is that we're thinking about how these specific terms find their way. So that general, find their way into Arabic language and their Arabic thought. So that general sort of culture of education, as you're pointing out, right? So I don't know that someone who goes to the Azhar, like Amin did, is necessarily going to be exposed to them. No. But in this kind of more broader, general way, in which people are living in a culture in which they are constantly being exposed to and navigating between different different intellectual traditions, different educational trajectories, different segments of society which have their own sorts of formation. I think that to some extent is, where there's a commonality, and the kind of commonality that becomes much more acute in the 20th century because there's, at least a century, perhaps more, at least a century of this, general orientation. Yeah. But actually, so some of the material that I've been looking at, which are not medicine, which I know nothing about, but science more broadly, astronomy, and you brought up Muqtataf, which is interesting because so one of the texts that I've worked with in a different part of this project is an astronomy text, which is kind of a modern astronomy text, which is an 1880s text, actually, right? So this move away from Arabic to English, there's also a move in this, the kind of opposite translation happening, in which, English texts or, Americans, in particular, Protestant Americans in particular, are translating these new modern astronomical works, and there's all sorts of geological works, I think, and also, there may be others too that I'm less familiar with, in about this period, into Arabic, and that they're being actually made available as textbooks, not so dissimilar. So there's a kind of interesting shift happening at that time too, to make scientific learning much more accessible. So, but that's just a side point.
Any other questions?
Yes, thank you so much for these very interesting papers. My question is for the second presenter. So I think you contextualized Wahid's ideas and reading of what religion is, or what his reformulation of the concept of being very well. And you really showed how he had also this shared concerns of the time, like his more modernist or more secularly oriented equivalents, sort of. But I'm not sure whether the concept of Muslim secularity really captures his position. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate more why you think that Muslim secularity really should be the framework through which we should read his ideas of din, or his new ideas of what din is or what religious is.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So I think one of the things that I want to do is sort of disaggregate what we mean, and so that's why I don't use the word secularism, or I don't use it in this context that you're mentioning. So disaggregate what we mean about when we talk about secularism, and so elements of that could be referred to in a kind of looser way or weaker way as secularity. But those elements would include, the kind of typical political secularism that we understand, that it's a kind of institutional secularism. It's also used to refer, this is, other people's work, not just my own thinking. It could also be used to refer to kind of declining notions of religion, right? But then, so Taylor has a kind of third idea, which is thinking about secularism, or one understanding of secularism, as trying to untangle the kinds of what he calls the contexts of understanding, right? The kind of general intellectual contexts that make us think in ways that we might identify as secular in one of these more stronger versions, right? One of the things, I'm bringing together, a few people here, but one of the things that comes that people have pointed to is that this notion of religion is always accompanied by a notion of something that's secular, right? So if religion is something, then secular is something as well. That kind of idea of secularity is always sort of, so if I'm kind of going, tracking what is meant by religion, then there's always accompanying, shadowing notion of secularity, or of the secular that is also being tracked, even if it's not being tracked explicitly. So that's sort of, I'm not sure if that helps, but that's sort of what I'm getting at, what I mean. But
yeah. I understand your starting point.
Yes, okay.
But can we also trace that secularity in Wahid's analysis or writings or ideas? I understand the way he changed the way religious scholars look at what din is or what religious is, but has he himself elaborated on this idea of secularity? Or is it that you attribute, you see what I mean?
Yes, no, it's my analysis.
Of that secularity.
Yes, no, that's right. I mean, I'd be interested to if you think it's kind of an inappropriate usage, but it is my analysis, right? So it is my analysis that so the only kind of explicit statements he has about secularity is this response to Abdul Razak, in which he's kind of sees as very clear Almani, very strong secularism that is irreligious and so on, right? But I'm sort of putting that question to the side, right? There's that question. But no, the word secularity is also not crucial, I think, to the analysis. But I think it's part of it, and this is part of my analysis. It's not a word that he would use, certainly. In fact, the analysis of the changing in deen is something that, of course, he is not making explicit either, right? He is simply pointing out. Right. I mean, this is, I think, to understand this, I think one of the things that I try to do, and maybe in the larger version that hopefully anyways it's a little bit more evident, is to kind of trying to place that understanding of deen within a larger tradition from which he's departing. And so, he doesn't come out and say, I'm specifically understanding this in an entirely different way than my predecessors have, but nonetheless, I think part of that work is to try to put it into a context in which you sort of track those shifts.
My suggestion was not that it is totally inappropriate. I think if I can borrow the first presenter's argument. I'm not sure.
Yeah. But I mean, do you feel that sort of tracking this kind of change in religion that I'm trying to argue for also entails a certain kind of idea about secularity?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I think that's the argument. All that.
A lot of these scholars' achievements were, you can argue, they were common sense, more than being just exposed to modern or European thoughts on secularism. These were essentially religious figures following the prevailing religious dictates and working their minds through them and sometimes reaching secular conclusions by common sense. That's my thinking.
If I may, as Gramscian, common sense is precisely, I think, what two papers were trying to show. That is, how certain things have become common sense. So I think that that's also one of the connecting reasons why these two papers are not just juxtaposed in this workshop, but rather they speak to each other also on this level. Thank you very much both, and please join me in thanking them.